When the movie Idiocracy came out in 2006, it was satire. It exaggerated a future where language was sloppy, leadership was loud, and thinking was shallow. At the time, it felt absurd. Today, the question isn't whether it was funny. The question is, are we drifting in that direction? Now, if you haven't seen Idiocracy, it's a satirical film about an average man who wakes up 500 years in the future through an experiment and discovers that society has become deeply anti-intellectual. Language is simplified, leadership is theatrical, entertainment replaces thought, and institutions struggle to function because communication has eroded. It was meant to be exaggerated. That was the joke. But satire works by stretching real tendencies. What makes it uncomfortable isn't that it predicted the future, it's that some of those tendencies are already visible. And this isn't about intelligence, it's about communication. Because when communication weakens, clarity weakens, accountability weakens, and reasoning weakens. So the real question isn't, are we there yet? In some dramatic, apocalyptic sense. It's simpler than that. Are we protecting our communication culture, or are we slowly diluting it? Let's look at 5 shifts the movie exaggerated and ask calmly and honestly whether we're closer than we should be to reaching idiocracy. If communication is the foundation of a functioning society, the first place erosion shows up is in language itself. Language decay doesn't mean people are unintelligent. It means clarity becomes optional. In Idiocracy, language is exaggerated into crude slang and fragmented speech. Institutions can barely articulate ideas. Public discourse sounds loud but thin. And here's where it gets interesting. You've probably heard the phrase word salad, and I'm not talking about literal nonsense, mumbo jumbo, blah, 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 blah. I'm talking about fluent, confident language that never quite commits to a clear idea. Someone speaks for 45 seconds, and when it's over, you can't quote a single precise point. Buzzwords are stacked together, abstract phrasing that circles but never lands, answers that feel long but resolve nothing. If the sentence ends and meaning never arrives, that's not complexity, that's insulation. Because when language becomes vague, accountability becomes vague. And we see this today, not just in politics, but in corporate messaging, media commentary, influencer culture, confident delivery, polished tone, minimal clarity. Are we at full idiocracy? Not yet. But when confusion feels normal and clarity feels rare, that's not progress, it's drift. And language doesn't drift in isolation. It drifts alongside something else, attention. Because even the clearest language requires patience to understand. And that brings us to the second shift. A society that cannot sustain attention cannot sustain reasoning. In Idiocracy, entertainment is loud, chaotic, and deliberately mindless. The most popular television show is essentially someone getting kicked or hit repeatedly for laughs. It's exaggerated, but exaggeration magnifies tendencies that already exist. Because if people don't have the attention to evaluate substance, they evaluate delivery. And that brings us to the third shift. In Idiocracy, leadership is theatrical, public messaging is loud, and explanation takes a backseat to spectacle. It's absurd, but look closely. When spectacle becomes leadership, communication becomes performance. Confidence gets mistaken for competence, volume gets mistaken for authority, repetition gets mistaken for truth. And here's the part we don't talk about enough. Sometimes confusion isn't incompetence, it's strategy. If language is vague enough, no one can pin it down. If messaging is emotional enough, no one slows it down. If delivery is strong enough, substance becomes secondary. And when that happens, accountability becomes harder to demand. If clear answers are rare, but strong performances are rewarded, we're drifting. Let me grab a quick drink here.
This segment is absolutely not sponsored by Do the Blue, the thirst mutilator. Now fortified with high-impact buzzwords, premium-grade vagueness, and 300% more confident delivery per sentence. Do the Blue, because if it sounds official, it must be true.
It's got what conversations crave. Oh, I needed that. All kidding aside, when language becomes performance instead of explanation, we should probably be concerned, because communication is not supposed to impress. It's supposed to clarify. But when performance becomes the norm, something else quietly changes. We stop asking, is this accurate? And start asking, does this feel right? And that brings us to the fourth shift. In Idiocracy, decisions aren't guided by careful reasoning. They're guided by crowd reaction. Who gets cheered? Who gets booed? Who sounds strong? When feeling right becomes more important than being right, communication collapses. Questions start to feel like attacks. Nuance starts to feel like betrayal. Calm disagreement starts to feel threatening. Emotion matters. It always will. But when emotion replaces examination, clarity erodes. If asking, "What do you mean?" creates tension instead of clarity, that's a warning sign. If clarification feels dangerous, something is off. So are we at Idiocracy levels? Not fully. But when disagreement escalates faster than explanation, we're closer than we should be. Because communication requires tolerance for discomfort. And when discomfort becomes unacceptable, reasoning disappears with it. And when reasoning disappears, the effects don't show up all at once. They accumulate quietly. That's the fifth shift. Idiocracy wasn't really about stupidity. It was about erosion. Erosion of precision, erosion of accountability, erosion of patience, erosion of critical listening. And erosion is rarely dramatic at first. It looks gradual. It feels normal. It becomes familiar. In the film, infrastructure breaks down. Institutions struggle. Systems malfunction. Not because one person made one bad decision, but because communication degraded over time. Communication doesn't collapse in a single speech. It weakens one shortcut at a time, one vague answer, one unexamined headline, one emotional reaction, one moment where performance replaces clarity. And here's the real danger. It's not that we've arrived at some exaggerated future. It's that we normalize the drift. Because once drift feels normal, correction feels extreme. So are we there yet? Not completely, but pretending we're not moving in that direction would be dishonest. Now, let's move from analysis to action calmly. So what do? First, individually, protect your clarity. Speak precisely. Ask for definitions. Don't reward confusion with applause. If you don't understand an answer, don't pretend you do. Clarity is a discipline. Second, culturally, we shape the communication culture we tolerate. If we reward spectacle, we get more spectacle. If we reward outrage, we get more outrage. If we reward clarity, we get more clarity. Culture doesn't drift on its own. It drifts toward what gets attention. And third, immediately do these three things. First, slow your reactions and ask one clarifying question before forming an opinion. Second, expand your vocabulary intentionally because nuance requires language. Precision is resistance to confusion. Idiocracy was satire. Whether it becomes a documentary depends on whether we protect our communication or dilute it. And third, check out this video next because it has more of what you need to make your communication more meaningful to help us all from entering a state of idiocracy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you there.
Still not sponsored by Do the Blue, now with 400% more confident conclusions and zero measurable nuance. Do the Blue, because hydration is easier than clarification.